Hey there, I'm Scott Winfield, and welcome to Victorian Opera's web series Artists in Isolation. On this episode, we're delighted to be joined by the always brilliant director, Nancy Black. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You know that.
Nancy, tell us about your experiences sort of responding to and dealing with COVID-19.
Well, I think like many other people, my first response was, what is happening here? What is this? And then my children started hammering at me. They went a bit feral. They said I absolutely had to leave the city and go stay with my ex-husband and his wife up in the country.
With whom you have a wonderful relationship, I might add.
Yes.
It's an important clarification because otherwise that may sound like a punishment for some.
I know, but it wasn't. I knew it was going to be all right, but going up there in the country anyway. So I got up there. It's beautiful, just outside Avenel, and we were going into autumn, and it was absolutely gorgeous. Nobody up there was sick. And so my other sons, or my son who lives here, he and his wife are both doctors, and they were going into the front line, and they decided they'd send the kids up to stay with us. We had a miraculous month up in the country with no sickness, and just the four of us charging around the hills and going for long walks and lighting bonfires and taking care of the chickens and planting vegetables, playing ferocious games of chess and backgammon, puzzles, of course, reading books. The only problem was there was no internet. And there was sort of in spits and splutters occasionally late in the afternoon. But at the same time as we were in this idyllic kind of a bubble, and the kids were growing into us, and we were all changing and became very relaxed, not just with one another, but with the kids. And I don't think any of us ever forget that time. But at the same time, because it was like all the projects that I had, and I had a very busy year ahead of me with various projects of one sort or another, they all collapsed. And so, of course, I made up some new ones. And suddenly, I had to make them come true. So I absolutely was having to be on Zoom and be on Zoom meetings and be talking to people in WA and talking to people in Sydney. And, it was like calling artists here, there, and everywhere, trying to see if they would be available to do this, if the funding came through, and we were going to do this great thing, and we were going to learn how to use videos for that and do something else for that and write a new opera. And it was, after a month, I had to come back. And I really felt sad about that. But it was a whole new beginning. Because I made all this new work. And now, oh my goodness, we have to find 48 hours in a day to make it happen. But immediately, I made 4 puppetry workshops for school kids that have been a very big success. And I've scrubbed down the bench tops, stripped them back, oiled and made them look gleaming once again. They haven't looked like that for 15 years. And made wonderful contacts with friends by phone and sharing books and taking our time. And gradually, I got to know the neighborhood, and I got to know the kids up and down the street. And I pulled some of them into one of my videos. And we started, all of us, talking to each other, and we shopped locally instead of going into the city. And I time became something quite different. A weekend was no longer a weekend. You didn't need a weekend so much. The whole week was just this unfolding of ideas and making things happen and deepening relationships and finding new ones. And I don't know. It's been. I know I'll be glad to when all of the restrictions have lifted. But it's been a very rich time. It's been lonely in some ways, but there's always Zoom, and I have Zoom meetings. Oh, and I had the most wonderful time teaching a group of students at the VCA. That was just delicious. And I just found out so many of the things you could do when you just say, well, this is it. Let's adapt here. Let's do this there. Boom. And yeah.
Nancy, everyone who's watching this will see that you have an incredibly joyous spirit. Where do you find joy? And who taught you to find it and see it?
I think it was my mum. She had a great sense of humor. And she was one of those people who she would go into moments and just let it unfold around her. And she just kept finding these extraordinary, she would tell me little snippets of her life. She and Dad traveled all the time. And I would just howl with laughter. She was so funny, and it was great. And my kids fill me with joy, also anxiety, but mostly joy. And I know a lot of nice people in this world.
I would love to speak about your work as a director. You're, of course, the artistic director of Black Hole Theatre.
Yeah.
And have directed many magical productions for Victorian opera, such as Four Saints and Three Acts, and most notably for me, Respighi's The Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah.
I would love to hear about your process as a director and where it typically starts.
It depends on the piece of work. So it's a different process for me if I'm devising a work on the floor with a group of performers. Then when I come to working with an opera, I read the libretto, preferably in English, because I can't speak any other language sufficiently, except for a bit of French. And I get a sense, and I listen to the music. And I think about what does this work want to express? What does it want to speak? What does it want to say? And I think about being on the receiving end of that. And because opera is such an extraordinary form, because of its use of visuals and sound and usually characters that make sense. And then I start thinking about, well, how, if I really need, before I begin rehearsal, to have a sense of what I think the opera's about, and to at least have a grasp of what I think I'm going to try and get the performers to express. But I work collaboratively with my performers in whatever form I'm working at. And I did, one of the most joyful times of doing that, partly because was with Sleeping Beauty, because I knew that opera was both funny and moving and sad and beautiful, and the opera singers were going to have to be puppeteers as well as singing, as well as acting. And I knew several of them, and I knew how good they were. And the thing that you need to build a context for them where they feel they can experiment, they can offer, and that you will work with their ideas. And they just they just give in spades. Absolutely. And it's such a joy. And sometimes you realize that your ideas were not the best. They had the best ideas. And go with it. And that was such a pleasure. I found that out in What Next as well. And the thing is, at the end of those experiences, it's not your show anymore, it's theirs. And they've been as important in the making of it as you have. But your responsibility is to give them a starting point and then to keep building a framework for them so that they can realize their full potential. And that's what I always strive for.
Nancy, when did you discover the power of puppetry?
Only when I was invited to direct for Black Hole Theatre. Black Hole Theatre, by the way, has nothing to do with my name. They were called that. They were named that by one of their founders, who wanted to call his company BHP, and couldn't for obvious reasons. So, but he wanted to call it Black Hole. I'm not sure if that was a cynical thing about how much money you throw at theater, or whether it was about energy. So I think about it as energy. Anyway, in 2001, they invited me to direct a show, a puppetry show called Caravan, and that had been written by a Melbourne visual artist and puppeteer called Paul Newcomb. And I'd never thought about puppetry. And I just loved it because it just provokes things that somehow the spoken word never does. It takes you to different places when it's done well and when it's at its best. I have to say my preference is not for puppets that walk and talk. So I don't particularly like marionettes. I always think, get an actor. But when puppets can do things that human beings cannot, then you find yourself transported. And that's when they really begin to speak to me. And one of the things that we discovered with Sleeping Beauty was the power. The singers were on stage singing the puppet, and the puppet was doing things that nuanced what the actors were doing and took it into other emotional areas. And that's when it worked beautifully, I thought. That was when it worked really well. And for me, that's when most puppetry works really well. We've got a children's piece that we do now called The Last Lighthouse Keeper, which has no words at all. And the kids, it's aimed at sort of ages 9 to down to about 4. And the kids just get it. They are absolutely enthralled.
And that's a work about grief.
Yeah. It's about death and resilience.
With your work as a director, the productions that I've seen have a magic-like quality to them. There's just something unspeakably special about the productions that I've seen that you've directed. What values underpin your work, and how do you create magic on stage?
It's a combination of things, you know. It's chance, it's working with the right people.
Yes.
It's a moment. I always think you need to leave things in. It's one of the things about working in theater that I think is very different to working in film, is that in theater, there's always a chance of change because you're working with your audience. And that in itself is magic.
Yes, the magical exchange of energy.
The exchange of energy. And
Yes.
It's never exactly the same. And the hard thing about film is working to a camera that doesn't give you anything. But you have to imagine a response, or the person standing behind the camera, or they've got somebody standing in. But that's a whole different exercise, for sure.
We've spoken a lot about The Sleeping Beauty, which you directed for Victorian Opera, which is such a curious and beautiful little gem of a work written in 1921 by Ottorino Respighi in Rome for puppets and singers. It's so curious and so unique within the world of opera. And written in the wake of the Spanish flu and the First World War. Tell us about this work, and it seems now to speak with more resonance than perhaps ever before.
Well, you see, because what I finally, I came to that opera with some misgiving, because I thought, oh, this is just another fairy tale. And then I read it, and then I was listening to the music, and then I understood where it came from, and I realized it was a piece about grief, about a catastrophe sweeping through a nation. And they did everything they possibly could to stop it happening, and they failed. And they had to go into lockdown for a long time. And when they came out, the world had changed. And this was embedded in the opera, but it was also the story of the world. So this opera, I saw it as, even 3 years ago, as a thing about communities coming through horror. And where do you find your resilience? And it was in their story, in the telling of the story about what they were going through. And of course, in the world they come into, one of the people dominating the Prince's party is a terrible American capitalist. And he had to be played as the Orange Baboon.
I've briefly forgotten the character's name, but isn't it, his name is Mr. Dollar something?
Mr. Dollar Check, yeah.
And here we are.
And here we are. Indeed. Here we are, and it's the 100th anniversary. It's just at all, wow.
Nancy, as our final question, what's the first thing that you would like to do once this time passes?
I guess the only thing I'm really missing is seeing my family in the States.
Yeah.
And I'd like to be able to hop on a plane.
Nancy, it has been such an absolute joy to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us, and please stay safe.
You too, Scott. Love to everybody there.
For more chats with artists in isolation, you can follow Victorian Opera across social media or visit victorianopera.com.au. I'm Scott Winfield. Thanks for watching.